Hi, I'm Dana Han-Klein here with Jeff Nichols for Loving.
My law professor of a mother was the one who told me about this film, and she pleasantly reminded me that I wouldn't exist, potentially, without this film or the events in this film.
Right.
So I guess the word responsibility kind of comes to mind, and I'm sure you've heard that a lot revolving around this film and sort of the telling of this story. So I'd love to know, like, how do you approach telling a story like this as opposed to one of your own that is more fictional?
Well, for sure, I think there is a massive responsibility when you're telling Richard and Mildred's story, but oddly enough, I think in order to bring it down to earth and not make it seem like a task I wasn't up for, I tried to narrow that responsibility to Richard and Mildred. So the impact of the court case, which is so massive, the impact of the the Supreme Court's decision, which has impacted so many people's lives, that is all going to be a residual effect of the way that Richard and Mildred lived, the way they lived their lives. The thing that bothered people about Richard and Mildred was that they existed, and there's no real way to fight or argue against your own existence other than to just continue existing. And that's what we made a movie about. We made a movie about the day-to-day lives of these people that shows the commitment and the love between the two of them over a near decade period of struggle, a near decade period of time when people were telling them they did not belong together, which probably went on much longer after the court decision, though legally they would no longer be challenged. We wanted to make a movie about the specifics in their lives, because that seems like the best way to make the argument, the best way to say, look, these are real people at the center of this debate, and how can you argue against that?
Was there ever a temptation to sort of make it a big sweeping court drama? Because for me, it ended up being, in a good way, like a story about people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time, who did the right thing at the right time.
Sure.
But I could see it, someone being like, let's make this about the law, whatever.
There's never a temptation for me to be that filmmaker and do that. But I remember early on speaking with the producers, because this was kind of on the heels of The Help coming out and making a ton of money and being a huge, huge commercial success. And I was like, guys, you have the potential with this story to probably make something quite commercial and quite feel good. I'm probably not going to do that. For starters, I knew just from watching the documentary that I wasn't going to go into the Supreme Court at any length of time, that there would just be a hint of it. And so, yeah, there was never a question on my side of the table of how I would do it, but I definitely threw that out to the producers of like, now's your time to jump ship, because this is going to be a very stoic interpretation of their story, because I think it represents them adequately. But that doesn't mean the court case isn't fascinating, and those lawyers are fascinating, and they're great characters, and the process of getting that case through the state courts, the federal courts, the Supreme Court, it really is amazing, and it shows us how, I think in a good way, our court system works. But that's not what I wanted to make a movie about.
One of the interesting things I found about the film is, like, it's sort of, the antagonist isn't necessarily like a character or a traditional antagonist. It's like all of society.
Right.
It's just sort of the circumstances under which they're in. But how do you tell a story like that?
I was ashamed when I first saw the documentary and I didn't know about this story. Why? Why don't we know this story? Your mother knows this story probably for multiple reasons, but partly because she's a lawyer. Everybody's taught this in their constitutional law class as a fundamental case, but it should be a fundamental part of our American history. I think kids need to be taught this because it's an important idea about equality and about the complexities of racial dynamics in our country. This is a big part of our American history, and it angered me to not know about it. But when you talk about bad guys in movies, which one of the producers early on came to me and said, "Well, who do you think the bad guy is?" And That's a very fair question because we're making a movie, but I don't think there is one. I think the situation, which is dictated by society, that's the bad guy. It's this permeating feeling of dread and terror that must be hanging on these people's lives for nearly a decade. You know, that is harrowing, and it is systemic. You know, this is a dread, this is a fear that has hung over the black community for a very long time, and I would argue still does. There's a reason why President Obama is telling people to have conversations with their black children. You know, as a society, we have to recognize these things, and so yeah, it's not an active effort to shame my audience, but it is an active effort to bring them into an understanding of the psychology of the people that have to live this way, which isn't necessarily a majority of the audience.
So what connects you to this? It's very much a story of race, and
Yeah.
what connects you to that? Because, you know, you're talking about a different community than yours, potentially, and that comes up in
At least half.
Yeah. Well, no, it comes up in the film, and it's when Richard's like sitting, and they're like, "Hey, you know, you're not black, right? Like, you know, this is an issue you connect to, and now you're embroiled in." But like,
Right. Well, I guess maybe I felt a bit like that. You know, I don't think this is a conversation just for the black community.
no, absolutely not. No, well, and but you say black, but it's also like, I'm Asian. It's a conversation for us. It's a conversation for Hispanics.
Absolutely.
It's everybody of color and everybody of not color. You know.
Yeah, I guess I'm in the not color group, and I, in order to have a dialogue, though, you have to have multiple parties at the table, and I'm one of those parties, you know, and I honestly, though, since I didn't approach this as a film with an agenda, I approached it as a film about these two people.
It seems like a love story, honestly, that's just had
It is a love
under
story.
extreme circumstances.
It's a movie about marriage,
right,
and commitment, and ultimately love. I very much identified with Richard. That's easy, but I identified with Mildred as well, in two main ways. One, in her connection to nature and place. You know, I grew up in Arkansas, and I understand what it's like to love a place, even to love a place that you have problems with. And that's what it means to be a Southerner in my life. And she was very much connected, not just to her family and the idea of home, but the nature of that place. But also, and this may sound absurd, but they very much reminded me of my grandparents. So obviously we're not interracial, but in terms of the dynamics of their relationship, my grandfather was very much like Richard. And what happens when you're married to a man like that is you become the emotional voice for that family. My grandmother was the one that wrote us birthday cards and said, "I love you," and gave us hugs. And my grandfather felt all those things. He just wasn't his, area of expertise in expressing those things. Now, Mildred very much had to be the emotional voice of this family, but beyond that, she then had to be the voice that propelled a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court and changed the trajectory of our nation. So, but it came from the same place. It came from the same relationship dynamic. So I felt like that's something I understood. Now, if you're looking for someone to go, make a film about the intricacies of the civil rights movement in the Jim Crow South, I'm probably not the guy you call. I'm not an expert on it. And if the right story came along, maybe I could become one. But I felt connected. I felt very emotionally connected and personally connected to these two people. But if you watch that documentary, it's kind of undeniable, that connection. I think a lot of people could have done what I've done with this story.
I don't necessarily think that's true. I thought it was really well handled. And I appreciate that it was a love story, right? It's not this like beat you over the head, like this is a political thrill, It was like, no, this is everyday people, and everyday people are being affected by the decisions that the Supreme Court makes. And I think, you know, with this film as a reminder, and even last year, you know, with all the marriage equality stuff, it's a kind of scarier reminder of how much, you know, our everyday lives are affected by that. So if you could say one thing to voters, since this film comes out a couple days before the election, what would it be?
Well, think about the importance of the Supreme Court. Think about Chief Justice Warren's court and what they were able to achieve in the 60s. Think about how important their approach to this subject matter was. And know that we are in those times now, and we have decisions that important to be made now. And that's the decision you're making when you go out to elect the next president of the United States.